So we are live now, we're recording. So we're continuing on, we're doing Unit 2 today with our AP in the time of Corona. And we're gonna start by I wanna look at two practice questions for Unit 2 that Mr. Canine made, and then we're gonna come back to these questions at the end and see how we feel about them. So remember, we have two questions, one's argumentative and one is quantitative. So Ms. Bailey, who was also on the AP Comparative Design team with me, she's in the video where they answer the questions, and so she was putting some advice on our Facebook page today. I've written down a lot of different things that she said, and we're going to do some specific skills with our essays later on. All right, so develop an argument that assesses the effectiveness of term limits on constraining an executive branch power. Use the following course concept in your response: authoritarian regime, and then you're going to respond with the defensible claim, of course, with the reasoning using the course concept, and then you're going to have two specific pieces of evidence. Now, one of the things that Mrs. Bailey pointed out is that both of your evidence can come from the same country. So those of you who are very worried because we didn't really get to cover Iran and Nigeria as well as I normally would have thanks to COVID, that can really help you out as long as your country choices aren't just Iran and Nigeria. They've been providing usually 4 to 6 countries in your list. All right, and good luck on your exam, Nathan. So you just duck out whatever time you need to. And like I said, this will be, I'm doing these, of course, recording these, so you'll be able to watch anything that you do miss, Nathan.
Okay, thanks.
And guys, just so we'll come back to this, but think about that concept of executive term limits. Think about which countries have term limits, who doesn't have term limits, like when you're looking at that list, and then which of our countries are authoritarian regimes and which are not. So then here's one that, again, this one is for Mr. Canine, and this is a sample of the quantitative analysis. Remember, we're always going to get some kind of data, some kind of chart, some kind of graph, and the first question is always going to be explaining something about it. And we're going to we know that in the question, we're going to at least have 2 countries that we're having to look at. So I've got executive roles in the AP6 countries, the CG6, head of state, head of government, commander-in-chief. And this one, of course, is a little dated because it still has, no, it's correct because it has Boris Johnson. And it even has our most current prime minister. So I thought that Dmitry Medvedev was hard to say. I think Mikhail Mishustin is just as hard. So these quantitative, I think, are a little step easier. So we're looking at how a pattern of information relates to democratization in the UK, draw conclusions about executive roles in authoritarian regimes, and explain how the information in the table relates to a parliamentary hybrid system in Russia. So we're going to come back to this. So these are kind of things we're going to talk about today. So our topics today are presidential versus parliamentary, and also including semi-presidential with that, or mixed system, whichever term you prefer. Then we're going to look at those executive offices. What do the head of state, head of governments do? What is their term limits? How do we get rid of them? What about our legislatures? What is their organization? And then our judicial system. So this is our political institutions unit, and this is a big chunk of what we do when we study these courses. So I just kind of start off reminding us about our CG6, that the UK is the only true parliamentary system that we study. China is authoritarian. I would consider them to be sort of a mixed system, kind of semi-presidential. But often when we think about these, we just say China's authoritarian. Russia is a semi-presidential. Iran, I would also consider just like China. It's kind of semi-presidential, kind of a mixed system. Mexico and Nigeria are both presidential, and they're extremely similar to the United States, so that makes it easy if you're kind of like, oh, what's the answer? My suggestion always is, if you don't know the answer for a Mexico or Nigeria question, pick what's closest to the US. That's often going to be the answer. And then I'm just throwing in the USA because we often use it as a comparison that the USA is also presidential. All right, so we're thinking about presidential versus parliamentary. Why would a country choose one? What are advantages, disadvantages? So when we're thinking about presidential, so presidential is typically directly elected by the people. So in the United States, we have electoral college, but India and us are the only countries who use electoral college. Otherwise, we're just voting directly. In Russia and Nigeria and Iran, they can have runoff elections where if you don't have a certain number of candidates getting a majority of votes or over 50%, then you can do a runoff, a runoff election. So there might be restrictions. So for example, like Nigerian presidents need to get 50% of the vote in 2/3 of the states, but they're elected directly by the people. They also typically have a fixed term, like they're serving in the United States and Nigeria for 4 years, and that's re-electable. They can serve again for a second term. In Mexico and in Russia, they're going to serve for, the presidents are going to serve for 6 years, though in Russia they may run again. And right now, and so the idea that they can run 2 terms, and they have to take 1 off. So Putin is looking at maybe changing that, like how long he can run. Typically the president performs like both roles of head of state and head of government. So we think back to our little pyramid where we have the state, head of state at the bottom, head of government at the top. So in a parliamentary system, your prime minister, who's your chief executive, is typically the head of government. Okay, so in a presidential system, that person serves both roles. And they typically have veto power. So we would see that the Nigerian president, Mexican president, American president, they all have veto power. In a parliamentary system, one of the things that distinguishes them is that they're chosen by their legislature. So therefore they're indirectly elected because the people don't directly elect them. The people elect the members of parliament, the members of the legislature, and then from the majority party, they choose a prime minister. Typically in a parliamentary system like we see in the UK, Boris Johnson, the prime minister, is the head of government, and then the ceremonial roles is completed by the head of state, which is the queen. Now, in semi-presidential systems, okay, like Russia's a semi-presidential, they have a president and a prime minister. So there are some kind of different roles they serve. The majority of power in a parliamentary system, it's in the executive because there is no it's in the legislature because there's no separation or really true distinct separation of your executive and legislative branch. Rather, your executive comes out of your legislative branch. Versus in a presidential system, you should have more of a separation of powers and checks and balances. And in a parliamentary system, the prime minister doesn't necessarily have veto power, but really they wouldn't need it because the policy is coming from your majority party. You're not ever going to have divided government in a parliamentary system, and divided government can exist and often does exist in a presidential system. It doesn't have to. Like, for example, AMLO, the current president, Andres Obrador of Mexico, he has control of the presidency and of his legislature. The other thing, that terms are not fixed in a parliamentary system. And so you can have them serve for a long time. So for example, the Conservatives have been in control of the British government for quite a while, but like Theresa May stepped down and now Boris Johnson is, David Cameron stepped down before her, even though they all were Conservative Party. And Theresa May called for a snap election. Remember that snap elections are those that happen before that required 5-year that they have to have in the UK. And so those are all events that could happen. I found this nice little chart I thought maybe kind of helps with elections, how that the voters like directly vote for the legislative branch and they directly vote for a chief executive in a presidential system. In a parliamentary, they vote for the legislature who then chooses the chief executive, the prime minister, but it happens indirectly. Now let's think about cabinets for a few minutes. So cabinets are very important. We're talking about them in the sense that that's one of these great comparisons. So in a presidential system, the cabinet members are chosen and most often go through approval in the legislature, which they do in Mexico and Nigeria and the US. And the role tends to be limited. They tend to be experts in their field. versus in a parliamentary system, especially when we're thinking about the UK, the purpose of the cabinet is, of course, to really just it's a party loyalty thing, and it's to reward those who are in the party, who are loyal, who have served. And there is this term that they often use in the UK, that the prime minister is just the first among equals. So I read this fascinating article about the UK when Boris Johnson had the coronavirus. He was not doing so well for a while. And all these people were talking about, oh, they were worried, you know, what would happen to the British government. And one of the cabinet members spoke up, and he's like, I don't know why everybody is so worried. Like, you realize that we have an entire cabinet that functions and runs the government. And he basically used that term, again, that the prime minister is the first among equals, and that they would continue on. Now, one of the things with the president in a parliamentary system, the prime minister, is that they do have to maintain the confidence of the majority so that they can keep on, and that definitely plays a role when they choose their cabinets. So when they had the coalition government in the UK under David Cameron with the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, then of course some of the cabinet members came into play from the Liberal Party and from Liberal Democratic Party and from the Conservative Party. I also want to mention real quickly with the UK, just a reminder of that vocabulary word, the shadow cabinet. So remember that the shadow cabinet is the opposite party, so the Labour Party in the UK, that they have people who follow and know what all of those folks are doing. When they have question time, which is one of the things I love about the British system, and they're questioning the prime minister, they also can question the cabinet members. So it's not just the prime minister that is answering during that time. So when we think about checks and balances and all those things, so in our, I meant to clean this slide up a little bit, but the on the left, of course, is the president, and on the right is a parliamentary system. So branches are very separate, independent of each other in theory. So for example, Mexico historically under the one-party system, their judicial branch was not very independent, neither was their legislature. So when I say in theory, that's how it's supposed to happen. It says that in their constitution, and it's happening more now, but it didn't always happen historically in Mexico. But they're all voted for, you know, separately. The legislature is appointed independent, you know, voted for by the people independently. There's supposed to be more checks and balances. So this is what we see happening in a lot of the West, and that has to do with, you know, us, the United States, and a lot of influence on Latin America. So parliamentary systems are very common in Europe, and the prime minister, or sometimes could be called a premier. Sometimes the title is even president, but they still have a parliamentary system. So this is a little chart that I got from Mr. Haregrove, and it's basically from the College Board, and it just is kind of a reminder about each of these people, how that the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, that he serves as the commander-in-chief, he's the chair, you know, of the military, all these things. His term, although he's called the president, he's also called the general secretary of the Chinese party, the Communist Party. And then we have in Iran, we have the supreme leader, and we also have a president who is elected. In Mexico, there is a president who, of course, is both head of state, head of government, serves the Sexenio, a 6-year term that is not re-electable. Nigeria has, again, a president who serves both head of state and head of government. And Russia has a prime minister and a president. The president is elected directly by the people, and the president appoints the prime minister. And then UK has the Queen and then the Prime Minister. So that kind of hits all of our heads of government, heads of state. So the UK, we have the Queen is the head of state and the head of government is the Prime Minister. And the Queen serves for life. When she dies, it will go to Charles, who will be king, and he will serve for life. And unless they abdicate, unless they step down, but there's no way to remove them. The prime minister, on the other hand, doesn't serve a fixed term limit, but can be removed with a vote of no confidence. And that happens when his party, not the opposition party, but his party or her party, in case of like Theresa May, has to call for the vote of no confidence. And if there is a vote of no confidence, then they will be removed from power. In Mexico, the president, who serves as both the head of state, head of government, serves a fixed term of 60 years, the Sahenya, where they cannot run for re-election. Currently, the president cannot be removed. There also is no vice president in Mexico. But the current president, AMLO, as everybody calls him, Andres Obrador, has introduced a referendum that has passed part of the legislature that would actually allow for removal. He is the most liberal president and the only one from that they've ever had. And so this is one of the moves that he's done to help kind of give more transparency. The former president, President Nieto, there was a lot of incidents of corruption. So when we think about term limits, like what's the good thing, what's the bad thing? So if you have a really great president, they can't run for re-election. If you have a really bad president in Mexico, you're stuck with them. And that kind of happened with Nieto. Nieto became very unpopular with a lot of different corruption and accusations of that during his time. In Iran, often we think of the head of government as being the more powerful, but in these countries that are mixed systems, they don't always work that way. So for example, the supreme leader is the head of state, but he is actually way more powerful. So supreme leader or Ayatollah, whichever name you prefer, it is the same thing. So Ayatollah Khamenei, with an A, the current leader, he serves for life. He is appointed by the Assembly of Religious Experts who also can have him removed, though that has never happened. The current leader, Khamenei, has been serving since 1989. The president, on the other hand, runs for election. Now, of course, remember the president comes from a vetted list of candidates. The Guardian Council, one of the other important groups in Iran, there are 12 of them. They can veto laws, so that's a power they have because the poor little president, and the current is Hassan Rouhani. He does not have the veto power, and he can be removed by the legislature, which is called the Majlis, and the supreme leader. The supreme leader, the Ayatollah in Iran, he has a lot of power. Just think about, I always like to say the M's. He has the power of the military, the media, the mosque. He controls what's heard and said in the mosque. And in a country that is a theocratic republic where religion is so important, that's important to control that. The Nigerian president can be removed through impeachment, through a normal process through the legislature. The same thing in Russia, the president can be impeached. In China, the National People's Congress can remove the president. However, the National People's Congress is basically just a rubber stamp. It has no real authority. They only meet for a couple of weeks in the summer, so the likelihood that they would actually impeach the president, not going to happen. Now, in China, the president had, for the last couple of terms, had a 10-year term limit. So originally under Mao, when Mao started, Mao served for life. And after Mao Zedong died, then we had Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping served for life. So eventually they implemented term limits. So Hu Jintao, who had served before Xi Jinping, the current president, he served for 10 years. And so the expectation was that Xi Jinping would also serve for 10 years. But he had things changed. Sounds a little bit like Putin. But he's an authoritarian leader, so what can we expect? And now there is no term limit for the Chinese leader. Okay, the names of our legislatures. Some of our legislatures are bicameral, having 2 houses, majority of them are, and then 2 of them are unicameral. So in Mexico, they function the same way the United States does, with pretty much the same powers. So if you have a strong US legislature knowledge, you're going to be fine with that. They have the chambers of deputies and the Senate, with the Senate doing a lot of the appointment approvals. In Nigeria, they have the House of Representatives and the Senate. It's actually the same names. In Russia, we have the Duma and the Federation Council. Now, in Russia and the UK are very similar in their legislatures in the fact that their lower house, the Duma and the House of Lords, are actually, the House of Commons, are actually the more powerful ones. So the Duma is much more powerful than the Federation Council, and the House of Commons is much more powerful than the House of Lords. And then in Iran, you do have the Majlis as your legislature, but there are some important other offices such as the Guardian Council and the Assembly of Religious Experts, and even the Expediency Council. In China, then we have the National People's Congress. I have some little charts I'm going to show you that will kind of maybe help put some of these together. Remember, you're never going to have to remember like the exact number of members of any of these, but understanding like electoral systems and those things can kind of help. For example, Mexico does a mixed system. Some of it is proportional representation and some of it is first past the post or single member district. And so same thing in Russia. So these mixed systems are kind of popular to make sure that lots of people are getting a voice. So in our judiciaries, how all these connect to each other, Mexico has a Supreme Court and it is becoming more independent. So for the justices of the Supreme Court, they serve for 15 years. They don't serve for life like they do in the US. And up until a couple of presidents ago, they actually would all resign when the president stepped down, and when the new president come in, he would get to pick new Supreme Court. So that definitely was not an independent judiciary. But they are becoming more and more independent and actually using judicial review. This is why Mexico has really, advanced in their democracy, making sure that rule of law happens, that people actually, there are laws and that it is followed, that it's not just the president arbitrarily making a rule. In Nigeria, they have two sets of laws, if you think about it. In the north, they have Sharia law, where it's a Muslim majority, and in the south, they function with normal, laws, rule of law, and they do have judicial review. We all know that Nigeria has a horrible reputation for corruption, so this is one of the things that the Supreme Court is trying to do to help fight that. Russia has a Supreme Court. It is not at all independent judiciary. The courts of Russia, there's actually 3 of them. The courts of Russia basically just reinforce what the government says. It is not at all an independent judiciary. Rule of law doesn't really happen. Putin can make an arbitrary rule. The UK doesn't, so these other countries really use what we call canon law versus common law. Common law is based on precedents, what we've done in the past, what previous court cases said. Remember that the UK doesn't have a written constitution. They don't have that reference back in the way that we do in, say, in the United States. In Iran, they're dependent upon Sharia law. There's also one of those great vocabulary words called jurist guardianship, which means that really only a religious leader has the right to fully interpret the law, which is one of the reasons that the Guardian Council has the power to veto law, because they're all clerics, meaning that they all have religious training. In China, they have what we call rule by law versus rule of law. And so it's whatever the party says is law. So I just put a little note. This is kind of a quote. This is a quote from the curriculum from the AP Comparative Guide, that how independent your judiciary is depends on how much authority that the courts have. Like, can they actually overrule the executive and legislative actions? Like, it's one thing to say in your constitution you have judicial review. It says that in the Russian constitution, but it's not actually happening, okay? And that's why it's so important that we have to have rule of law for a country to truly be a liberal democracy. Independent judiciaries are a strong thing. Like, that's what we want. And honestly, when we think about judicial review, my students know that, I mentioned this, I did a paper on this for a class that I took on judicial branch, and that the US, we really are the leader for what it looks like, what judicial review, rule of law, those things happen, and that our courts truly are an independent judiciary. And their job is to protect our civil rights and our civil liberties and ensure that rule of law is happening, okay? That's an important idea, that how important independent judiciaries are. So I have some images here, some graphic organizers to kind of help you. I want to really draw your attention to the red triangle here, because this is really kind of the focus of what China looks like, its structure. So at the bottom, we have the National People's Congress, and this is the Congress that meets. They only meet for 2 weeks in the summer. And then they choose, it's the Central Committee, then the Politburo, and so on. And so, Xi Jinping, the General Secretary, the President, he's not chosen, by the people. He's chosen by these elite groups, these Central Committee. They come, and, the Politburo, they meet in secret, okay? And so there's definitely this lack of transparency there. And then you can see kind of how the president is over like all these different groups, okay? So just kind of to show you how these different things work. sometimes visuals help for folks. If you don't like this one, I have a second one for China, if this one makes a little more sense. And this shows you who elects, who has authority over who. And so like who chooses which one, you know, those kind of things. So if this makes a little bit more sense for you. And Xi Jinping, he's over the party, he's over the military, and he's over, you know, the government. So he serves in all those. He has a lot of power, a lot of power. This one is for Iran. So we do have the current president here, Hassan Rouhani, and then Ayatollah Khamenei. And so the elector elects the president, they elect the parliament called the Majlis, and they also elect the Assembly of Religious Experts, which is 86 religious clerics. No women are allowed to serve because women cannot be clerics. The Assembly of Religious Experts appoints the Supreme Leader, who serves for life, and the Supreme Leader appoints the head of, basically appoints the head of the Judiciary, like we could say your Chief Justice. The Ayatollah then appoints 6 of the Guardian Council, and the other 6 are appointed by the head judiciary. The Guardian Council has 2 very important powers. They get to veto any candidate, vet any candidates, and veto any laws. Get my V's mixed up here. The Expediency Council, they handle any kind of disagreements between the Guardian Council and the president, and they're kind of a mediator group. And those are appointed by the Ayatollah as well. You notice if there's a disagreement, people are siding with the Ayatollah. The only check on the Ayatollah is the Assembly of Religious Experts. They could get rid of the Ayatollah, and I don't really see that happening. There is a cabinet. They do have to be confirmed by Parliament, by the Majlis, but they are appointed by the president. Okay, and the Guardian Council not only vets the candidates for president, they also vet the candidates for Parliament. I have another one if this works better. Okay, now, and this one, it does have an older picture. This is President Ahmadinejad, who served in the early 2000s, but this is, and here's the original Khomeini to Khamenei kind of thing here. So I think this is right. They have different glasses. This is your current one. Okay, this is Khamenei with an A. So this kind of shows just his different power and who kind of checks who. So you can kind of go back over these, any of these, but it's whatever visual really works better for you. And then this one I found for Russia that I believe a teacher had created. I thought this one was really good. I kind of like this, like who does what. So you've got the citizens who vote for the president, okay? And the citizens also, you know, vote for your, for the Duma, okay? And all the people, you know, how they're voting for each of these groups. The president, of course, nominates the prime minister and then nominates the members of the courts as well. Also nominates his cabinet, and those are approved by the, I can't remember if they're approved by the Federation Council or by the Duma. Okay. Then this one is for Mexico. I just liked this one because I liked all the information that was in it. Because I don't think that Mexico's government structure is really that hard to understand. But what I liked about it was just, I just loved all these, the different structure and things on here. So if this works for you, this one is kind of a nice one as well. Then this one is for the UK. Just the idea that we have the elected legislature who chooses the prime minister. At the center, of course, you have the monarch. HM stands for Her Majesty's Government. So remember that the prime minister actually has to ask, the queen asks the prime minister to form a government on her behalf. There's that great clip that's at the beginning of, I remember what the movie's called. I think it's called The Queen, but where Tony Blair has to go and ask the Queen to form a government. Okay, and remember the House of Lords is appointed. They serve for life. It is very prestigious to be appointed. They have very little power. they can amend and make suggestions. The Queen does actually have veto power, has not been used in hundreds of years. This is 1700s, I believe. This is a little hard to read, but I just really like this one because it had such good information in it too. So the Nigerian folks, they vote for the Senate, the House of Representatives, they vote for the president. This one is older. It's even where it says, good luck, Jonathan. And the current president, of course, is Muhammad Buhari. All right, that was a lot of information. So let's go back to the very beginning here. And let's see, let's start with the easier of the two questions, okay? So explain how a pattern of the information of the table relates to democratization in the UK. So remember that democratization is the growth of democracy. Another fancy word we have is democratic consolidation, and we would say that definitely the UK exhibits democratic consolidation. Okay, how a pattern of information in the table relates to the democratization of the UK. So as we look at this, what do you notice here about kind of some of these different things? So the head of state, the Queen, she's not the commander-in-chief. Rather, the commander-in-chief is in the hands of Boris Johnson, who is the head of government, okay? So kind of making sure that the head of government is elected. So what we know that the elected government, his elected person is the commander-in-chief. What can we see about executive roles in authoritarian regimes? Also, I would make sure that I explain what democratization is. So remember, that's an important thing to define. So what we notice about our authoritarian regimes, so you got to know which ones are authoritarian, right? So we're looking at Russia, Iran, and China. And as we look at those, what do you especially notice about, say, you know, what I can see is that the head of state is also the commander-in-chief in all of my authoritarian regimes, isn't it? The only ones that are different that also are the head of state and the commander-in-chief is Mexico and Nigeria because they're both presidential, okay? So I could draw the conclusion that in an authoritarian regime, the head of state is almost always, or in this case, in all these authoritarian regimes, the head of state is the commander-in-chief. Explain how the information in the table relates to the parliamentary hybrid system in Russia. So in Russia, they have a parliamentary hybrid system or a semi-presidential system. And so typically the head of state, like in the UK, doesn't have as much power as the head of government. But in the case of Russia, the president, Putin, has a lot of power. And so you could talk about that, the fact that they do have a president and a prime minister. So notice, they're not giving you any of these titles. They're assuming that you know that Mexico has the same head of state and head of government because they have a presidential system. They're assuming that you know in Russia that Putin is the prime minister and that their president, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here, and that their head of government is their prime minister. Okay, so there is some assumption that what you know, that when you look at Iran, you know that Khamenei is the head of state, is the Ayatollah, and that Rouhani is the head of government, the president, okay? And you don't even have to know those people, but just knowing that the prime minister is the head of government in Russia, okay? All right, so let's come back to the argumentative, because those are definitely the tougher questions. Before I go on, are there any questions?
I have a question about that. Li Keqiang, the head of government for China.
He's the vice president.
Oh.
Actually, his title is premier. So he's considered to be what we would say is like a prime minister role.
Okay. Does he have any legitimate power?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's not even necessarily somebody we might see become, like just because he serves in that doesn't mean that he is going to become the next general secretary. No, because that hasn't happened necessarily in the past. He's actually, well, I don't actually know his age. He looks very young, but yeah. Okay. Good question though.
He's 64.
Really? He looks really good for his age. Like really good. How old is Xi Jinping? XI.
He is 66.
Really? Interesting. I can't believe Li Krangon is only 60. Is 60
Yeah, this Li Keqiang, I would have thought that he was maybe
40, right? Yeah.
at most.
He looks a lot younger. All right. So develop an argument that assesses the effectiveness of executive term limits on constraining. So constraining, we need to rein back in, right? Limit an executive branch's power. And use the course concept in your response authoritarian regime. Okay? So here's the question. Do term limits help limit executive branch's power?
I would say no.
Okay? So give me an example of a country that has a term limit, but it hasn't really helped limit the power.
Could we use O? I guess I would have to say yes, because that would be easier. Because I was going to think, like, China doesn't have a term limit, and their president pretty much is omnipotent. Then you
Okay.
have, like,
Iran
Russia.
also doesn't either, does it?
Who?
So Iran, their supreme leader doesn't have a limit.
And then also there's Russia, who is changing their laws to
Could you talk about how that Putin has been in some form of power since 1996 or 97, how that he's gone from prime minister to president and back and forth? Sure. And the fact that he can continue, that there's no, so what could we draw a conclusion then? So could we say something to the extent of that in authoritarian regimes, the lack of term limits only strengthens the executive branch, doesn't it?
I would, yeah.
Okay, so then if we want to say to assess the effectiveness of term limits, so we could say that term limits, could they prevent countries from becoming authoritarian regimes? Because here's my kind of other thought. Mexico was one-party rule for a long time, and they did have term limits, but there still was a lot of authoritarian power. I wouldn't necessarily call them an authoritarian regime, but they were definitely an illiberal democracy, okay? So what you're gonna have to do in your response, you need to define what an authoritarian regime is, okay? You need to relate that. So if you pick your stance, whatever your stance is going to be, okay? And then talk about how authoritarian regime relates to that. So in an authoritarian regime, we're not going to see free, fair, competitive elections. You're going to see power consolidated, okay? And you could say your strongest example is China. China you also feel more comfortable with than you do Iran and Nigeria, so write about that, okay? You could also use Russia as a perfect example as well. On another hand, you could also use the UK because they don't have term limits either, but yet they don't have an authoritarian regime. So there's not necessarily a correlation between, or a causation between term limits and executive power. Part of it probably comes into the play of, for example, in Britain, they do have the ability to remove their leader. It's very unlikely, like there is the power to remove both the Russian president and the Chinese president, but the likelihood of that happening, same thing in Iran, there is a power to remove him, but the likelihood of that happening. All right, so the question is, can you come up with something here to get at least a couple of points? Can you give me a definition of authoritarian regime? Could you talk about term limits in at least one of these countries? And you could use one country twice, but in a question like this, it's going to be better if you're using two countries for your evidence. In some questions, it would work to use the same country twice, okay? So you could talk about how that, like China, when they had that small time period where they did have term limits, you could, if you wanted to try to argue that both. But if you don't know that really well, that might not be your best bet. So I do think that, you know, China is an easy one to go with this. You could also talk about, you know, Iran. In Iran, the president can only serve 2 terms. So it's an authoritarian regime. So one of the ways that they keep the president's power in check is that the president doesn't get to serve as long as, say, the supreme leader. So you gotta, whatever you do, make sure you bring it back to that. Are the term limits, how effective are they in reining in the power of the executive branch? And then you're just saying they are effective or they are not effective. And you can argue either way on this. And then you just have to tie in that term of authoritarian regime. We're going to keep doing these because I think we're just going to have to do like a ton of examples of them to really kind of feel stronger about them. All right.